But anyway, we're very fortunate today to have Dr. Todd Hylton come and speak with us. Todd is the executive director of the Contextual Robotic Institute and professor of practice in the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department at UC San Diego. His research includes novel computing systems and their approaches to autonomous vehicles and robotic systems. Prior to his appointment at UCSD, he was executive director of strategy and research at the Brain Corporation, a San Diego-based robotics startup. From 2007 to 2012, Dr. Hylton served as a program manager at DARPA, where he started and managed a number of projects, including the Nano Air Vehicle Program, the Synapse Program, and the Physical Intelligence Program. Dr. Hylton received a PhD in applied physics from Stanford and a BS in physics and a BS in physics from MIT. Todd?
All right, good morning, everybody. So today I'm going to talk about a topic that I call thermodynamic computing, which turns out to be very closely related to neuromorphic computing. And so this is a topic that's been on my mind actually ever since I started the Synapse project. So I'm going to tell you sort of what I'm thinking about, where it is we might go and how we might address some of the basic problems we have today. So here's the outline for the talk. First, I'll do a little bit on motivation, care about, any of the things that I'm going to say. I'm going to talk a little bit about thermodynamics because I think although the ideas are simple, it's extraordinarily difficult for most of us to intuit what they are telling us. I'm going to try to do that as best I can. I've always found this topic to be incredibly difficult. Then I'm going to switch gears and talk about a vision for thermodynamic computing, what I think computing might look like in the future. And then finally, I'm going to present what I call a thermodynamic neural network model, in which I have attempted to capture all of these ideas into a functional neural network, which is not like anything I think that has been done before. And then I'll offer some conclusions. The motivation. So here are just a few observations. So computing absorbs about 5% of the U.S. electrical power production today. Next generation semiconductor fabs are projected to cost $20 billion. And Moore's law is apparently on its last legs. But also, electron devices are comparable to the size of biological molecules, and at that size, thermodynamic fluctuations are a challenge. In fact, they're inevitable. And I'll also note, paradoxically, while we work very hard to avoid these fluctuation effects in hardware, we create them in software by generating random numbers and probability distributions. However, we are still roughly 1,000 times above the Landauer limit for thermodynamic efficiency in computing. Our computing systems today possess far more computational potential than we can ever program. And we are still many orders of magnitude less capable and less energy efficient than brains. And so my conclusion is that we are in the late stages of a mature technology paradigm, but we are still a long way from fundamental limits. There's a few more thoughts. So I think that a primary problem in computing today is that the computers cannot organize themselves. And so basically we have trillions of degrees of freedom doing the same stuff over and over again because this is what we've been able to tell them to do. And I think that machines are ill-suited to evolving complex real-world problems because while a machine can transform energy, the computers that we build today cannot evolve because they are literally frozen. They are too cold, intentionally so. It makes them deterministic, makes them do what we want, but it also makes them inflexible. And lastly, I would note that machine learning systems almost universally employ thermodynamic concepts, but still they are ad hoc solutions that lack an overarching sort of physical idea to unify them. So here's what I call the thermodynamic computing hypothesis. First of all, why thermodynamics? Why should we look at thermodynamics at all? My argument is that thermodynamics is universal. It's the only field of human understanding that absolutely applies everywhere without exception. It is temporal. The second law of thermodynamics is the reason for the direction of time. In fact, it's the only reason we understand why anything should ever change. Thermodynamics is efficient, and by that I mean when I look at evolved systems, whether they're biological systems or human systems, they're constantly changing in order to become more thermodynamically efficient, to become better at what they do. And the last comment I'll make is that thermodynamics is not mechanistic. It's not possible to describe the ideas in thermodynamics, and in particular the idea of the second law of thermodynamics, as a machine. So my hypothesis is that thermodynamics drives the evolution of everything, and that thermodynamic evolution is the missing unifying concept in computing and in many other domains as well. And I'll say a little bit more about this later, but I think that electronic systems are extraordinarily well suited to do thermodynamic evolution if we knew how to take advantage of it, how to do it. So my conclusion is that thermodynamics should be the principal concept in future computing systems. So a little more on the motivation side. I've divided the world up into 4 boxes here, and on the lower left I've got things that are programmed. On the horizontal axis I've got things that are programmed versus things that learn, and on the vertical axis I've got things that are dynamic or online versus things that are static or offline or in a virtual world. So when I was a young man, pretty much everything was down here. I had a computer sitting on my desktop. It was entirely programmed, and everything it did was offline. Now, in the past few decades, we've taken our technologies into these other quadrants. We now have computers that we can carry around with us in the real world. They're still overwhelmingly programmed, however. They do very little adaptation on their own. And we've built enormous data centers. We call them the cloud, typically. And this is sort of where the machine learning world mostly lives. So there is some learning here. It's still largely programmed. There's some learning going on here, but it's mostly static or offline data sets. Now, the stuff that everyone talks about in the tech press and sort of the coming future is up here, right? It's the robots, the things that I worry about every day at our Robotics Institute. It's the autonomous cars. It's smart cities. It's, a bunch of stuff that's in the real world that's changing. And this is critical because the real world is so complex that it's almost impossible to conceive of programming a solution to it. It essentially has to be learned, which is, I think, part of the challenge with self-driving cars, for example. So here's what I think of as a somewhat related conceptual landscape in these 4 domains as well. So in the lower left, where things are programmed and offline, this is where we have arithmetic and algebra and searching and sorting and basically the classic stuff that computers do. In the upper left, there are ideas from physics, classical physics like calculus, differential equations, Hamilton, Newton's laws. All those ideas are sort of the dynamically modeled systems. On the lower right, we have ideas that I call statistical learning and inference. This is probability and statistics. It's equilibrium thermodynamics. It's machine learning. Now, on the upper right is the stuff I think that we don't understand very well, which is why we're having a hard time with many of the applications in these domains. I call this quadrant dynamic learning and inference, and I think that the ideas that should be better understood in order to succeed in this domain come from non-equilibrium thermodynamics. They are ideas of fluctuation, dissipation, adaptation, and equilibration, and what I would call multi-scale quantum thermodynamic evolution. These are the things that we don't really understand how to do yet. So now a little bit on thermodynamics. So when we're taught thermodynamics, typically, if you've ever taken the class, you're taught equilibrium thermodynamics. And in an equilibrium thermodynamics considers isolated systems. So I put a box, and inside that box here, I put a couple of things. I put some sort of, little dots. Think of them as gas molecules. They're bouncing around, but there's some sort of solid inside also. And we're taught that over time, what will happen is that the entropy of this system will increase, and it will become more disordered. And that this is what the second law of thermodynamics is about. However, isolated systems essentially exist only in the imagination of physicists and nowhere in the real world. In the real world, everything is an open thermodynamic system. And in the real world, exactly the opposite happens all the time. Because in the real world, what happens is that open thermodynamics take in materials and energy, and they expel heat and other waste materials. And in the process, stuff organizes constantly, everywhere. Everywhere you look, this goes on. Every single thing that's in this room is a result of this process, including us. Right? And this is what we don't really understand. Now, I contend that if we understood such things, that building computers that organize themselves would be a hell of a lot easier than it is now. This doesn't violate the second law of thermodynamics, by the way. It actually increases the rate at which entropy is increased, but it does so in the environment externally. So what happens is that as things organize, they facilitate the creation of entropy by connecting potentials in the environment. That was my conclusion for the slide. So, next slide. So just a few examples. I gave you the challenge that everything in this room is thermodynamically evolved. So here are some things where I think it's a little more transparent that it is the case. So take the case of the picture of the funnel cloud and the lightning bolt sort of in the middle there. So what happens is, there are potential differences between the upper atmosphere and the Earth. They can be temperature differences and electrical potential differences. And these structures, these funnel clouds or tornadoes or hurricanes or whatever, and lightning form, and as they do so, they relieve the potential difference that's between these two, between the Earth and the atmosphere, okay? So these are spontaneous organizations created that relieve potentials and create entropy in the environment in the process of doing so. But now even if you look at something as simple as boiling water, where there's a difference in temperature between the bottom surface, which is in contact with the heating element, and the air, what happens is, as the water boils, bubbles spontaneously form at the heated interface and move to the air interface. Okay? So this is an organization that has been spontaneously created, and what it's doing is it's transporting heat. Okay? That's what it's doing. It's relieving the potential associated with a difference in temperature. And, generically, I can see this everywhere, that potentials are constantly driving the organization of structures that dissipate those potentials. So here's an example that you may be familiar with, and one that always fascinated me as a kid. If you put iron filings on a piece of paper and you bring a magnet up from underneath, what happens is you get these beautiful patterns that form. These organizations are created. You can also feel the energy, that's being released as you bring the magnet up, which is ultimately dissipated in the formation of the structure because it's actually creating heat. The interesting thing about this example as well is that if I pull the magnet away, right, there are still remnants of the structure from the time that I had it there previously. So if I bring up the magnet again in a slightly different orientation, that previous structure will affect the new structure. So this is a kind of memory of the past, right, where a structure that has evolved in the past constrains the evolution of future structures. And also, to make the point further about living systems, I would like to comment that, if you look at these hydrothermal vents, you see these whole living ecosystems down there. And at the bottom of the chain is a bacteria that eats the chemistry that's coming out of the vent. And then there's this whole ecosystem built on top of that chemistry. But more generally, if you looked at the living ecosystem as a whole, it derives from things that aren't alive. So my contention here is that the examples that I showed you earlier, although they came from non-living systems because those things are much easier to understand, is that these ideas translate naturally into the living world as well. So about 20 years ago, a little more, Chris Jarzynski at the University of Maryland published a paper about thermodynamics, and in this case it was about non-equilibrium thermodynamics. And it's a relatively simple paper actually, but it says something really profound, it turns out. What it does is it replaces the second law inequality that we've typically learned in a thermodynamics class with an equality for open systems. Okay? So this relatively simple result is still, I think, widely unappreciated, but has been sort of expanded upon over the years. Once, in particular, by Gavin Crooks, with another formulation of what are now called these non-equilibrium fluctuation theorems. What this theorem says is that if you're looking at a non-equilibrium system and a system is transitioning from state A to state B, that if you averaged over all the paths that it would take from A to B, and then averaged over all the paths that it might take in the reverse direction, that you come up with this simple exponential relationship that looks a lot like a Boltzmann relationship. Okay? It's sort of the generalization of the Boltzmann relationship, but in this case for non-equilibrium systems. Others have looked at these non-equilibrium fluctuation theorems and tried to ask the question, sort of what are they doing? Okay, what does it mean sort of from a conceptual piece? And in this case, the idea was, well, we're going to drive this system with some potentials, and we're going to sequentially let the system relax as we drive it. And the result of this is, I'll not try to explain it here, is that as the systems evolve, they become more thermodynamically efficient, and that is equivalent to being able to predict the inputs that created the organization to begin with. Okay? So let me rephrase that. In order to be thermodynamically efficient, you have to be able to predict your inputs. Now that sounds intuitively correct. It's just that it's proven here. Okay? So here's my intuitive interpretation. You can look at these fluctuation theorems in different limits. And here's my intuitive interpretation of what they say. So if you look at a system in the high dissipation limit, it's what I call the novice. Okay, this is a system that's just being exposed to some new information or new potentials in the environment. And in this case, there's an enormous amount of energy loss within the system. There's lots of fluctuation. There's lots of adaptation and learning going on, and lots of mistakes being made. Okay? Now, if you contrast that to the condition of a system that is in the low dissipation condition, and this would be a system that presumably has been exposed to these potentials for some long period of time and been able to organize itself. This is what I call the expert. So the expert is able to easily take in inputs and create outputs without a whole lot of effort, and it looks fantastic, right? It's what we strive to be. And the process in between is what I call thermodynamic evolution. This is the piece that's not yet described by these theorems. They only describe the limits. They can only be evaluated in the limits. So now that was all the motivation in the thermodynamics, and now I'm going to talk about thermodynamic computing, or what I think computing might look like. So the first comment that I want to make about thermodynamics and computing is that this is not a new idea. Okay? If you look at the history of thermodynamics and computing, they have evolved over exactly the same period of time. Started roughly 200 years ago. And in fact, many of the advances in thermodynamics and computing were made by the same people. And often these were the most prominent scientists of their day. So I'm trying to give a context here that says that what I'm proposing is sort of the next step in what has been going on historically for a very long time. And the next step I think we are poised for because of new ideas like these non-equilibrium fluctuation theorem and because of the current state of computing. Okay? So to give a little more context to where I think thermodynamic computing would fit sort of in the broader world of computing today, I made this diagram. And so what I've got here are characteristic spatial and temporal fluctuation scales, right? And I've got representative values for essentially free electrons at room temperature. You can see 8 nanometers in space, and I don't know what that is, 5 terahertz in time. Okay, these are the representative fluctuation scales at room temperature for free electrons. Now, in the classical domain, this is the domain of computing that we're all working in today, basically all the people here. What happens is the size of the devices that we make are much larger than the fluctuations that are inherent in the system, or the energy scales are larger, equivalently. And so what that means is that we're essentially averaging over the fluctuations in each device in such a way that the fluctuations basically don't matter compared to whatever the mean field values are of the state variables. And for that reason, we can think about devices as having state, a macroscopic state, because the fluctuations are sort of averaged out. They don't matter. Okay? Now, in the quantum domain, what happens is we're essentially trying to make the fluctuations larger than the system is itself. We do this by making things very, very cold. All right? So in the quantum domain, we remove the fluctuations in another way, not by averaging over them, but by essentially getting rid of them. And when we do this is when we get all these cool quantum coherence effects. Right? But in between, there's this domain where I think the thermodynamic computing would and should fit, which is the domain that we carefully avoid today. It's the domain where we get complex, multi-scale physics. It fits right in between. And the challenge for both classical computing and quantum computing today is that the systems that they're building live right on the boundary of this thermodynamic domain. Okay? In quantum computing, you're desperately trying to get the fluctuations out of the system so you can get longer coherence times. And in classical computing, you're desperately trying to get rid of the fluctuations that destroy the determinism that you want to build into your system. So from another perspective, if I looked at a conventional computer today, I can see all of these domains, sort of. I mean, certainly the transistors and the gates that we build are in the classical domain. The atoms in the small molecules from which they are constructed are in the quantum domain because they're small compared to the fluctuations. There's not much in the middle today. Actually, there's nothing in computing today that's in the middle. But this is the domain of nanotechnology, large molecules, and biochemistry. This is where living systems are. Okay. So a few more comments about electronics and living systems. If I looked at living systems, then the characteristic energies are sort of eV to tenths of eV to a few hundred millivolts. And it's the same in electronics. It's the same energy scale. Also, the sizes are now comparable. The devices that we're building are on the nanometer scale. They are getting to the scale of molecules, of biological molecules. So my contention is that these electronic systems that we build today, if we knew what we were doing, would be able to evolve in a way maybe like living systems do. But they don't evolve today because we are killing ourselves making sure that they can't. Making sure that they stay in either the classical or the quantum domain. And we're doing this primarily, I think, because we lack the conceptual foundations to do anything else. So what might a thermodynamic computing system look like? Well, I imagine I have a thermodynamic computer. It's constructed of a bunch of components. I'll say more about that later, and I'll talk about it in the context of this neural network in a few minutes. But I'm imagining that this thermodynamic computer is connected to an environment in which there's potential that can drive its evolution. And it's the same potentials that we use now in computers. It's electrical power, it's information potential in data sets, it's all the usual stuff. Okay? Now, there's a conversion problem, I think, in getting those potential sources into a framework that both matters to us and that can be used in an evolutionary sense, but it's the same idea. So, now how would we use a thermodynamic computing system? Well, today I'm saying this is what a sort of a conventional computing system looks like today, and my point here is that this computer system interfaces to the world through us, right? That's the reason it does anything at all, is because we're the interface to the world. Whether it's the inputs, the outputs, the programming, we're the interface to the world. This is a of course, great importance because we want the computer to do something we care about, but it's also the cause of the great limitation that we can't do very much with our computers compared to what they should be able to do because we can't write the programs that actually do what we want. So I'm imagining, that this computer is connected to a thermodynamic computer, which is in itself directly connected to the world in some way through these energetic potentials, and that I'm able to apply constraints to this thermodynamic computer that give it the guidelines to do what it is that I care about rather than just randomly do stuff. In fact, this is the same architecture that Mike presented for the Loihi. It's exactly the same. It's just that I've placed it in a thermodynamic context rather than a neuromorphic context. The other point I would make is that about a thermodynamic computer is that the thermal reservoir is an active component of the system. It's the thing that provides the fluctuations that the system needs to do the evolution or the search of the space of potential configurations that it may take and then stabilize. It's not simply a heat sink. So the basic concept sort of within the thermodynamic computer is, at least as I can currently conceive it, is that there are some number of cores. You might think of them as neurons. They're connected to each other with things that might look like synapses, and that there are external potentials that are driving flows of current through this system. Now, as those currents flow through the system, some of it is dissipated within the system, becomes heat essentially. That dissipation creates fluctuations, okay? They create fluctuations in the states of the edges and the nodes, so forth, within the system. And that as the system evolves, it becomes better at transporting charge, its dissipation is reduced, its fluctuations are reduced, and then its state is stabilized into a solution to the problem presented by the energy in its environment. So here's a cartoon that I actually made at DARPA. So when I was at DARPA, after I started the Synapse project and the Physical Intelligence project, I tried to start a project called Thermodynamic Computing, but I failed because nobody understood what I was talking about, including me. And so I'm still working on it. But here was the sort of the concept slide that I had. I imagine I had a bunch of these cores hooked together. You can think of them as neurons if you like. And that there is a problem defined in the environment and the potentials of the environment that are attached to this thing. As a programmer, I can go in and fix some of the states, so say some of the elements, maybe some of them are neurons, maybe some of them are logic gates or bits of some sort. And then what happens is, as I sort of turn the system on, the unconstrained components fluctuate. And as they fluctuate, they find solutions that effectively transport and connect the potentials externally. And as they do so, their dissipation is reduced and the fluctuations go away and the system stabilizes. So here's a simple example of an element that I think we could easily build if someone chose to do so, which I call a thermodynamic bit. It's a couple of inverters connected together. In a thermodynamic context, it looks like a two-well potential. There's a barrier in between. We connect it to some environment which may shift the relative states of the two potentials. This thing feeds back to the environment itself, so the environment may change as it selectively stabilizes in a state. And then if we weight those connections, it can begin to learn so that what it's done in the past influences what it does in the future. Simple idea. So I think this is probably the most simple thermodynamically evolvable element that I can imagine, but I don't think it's actually been built. Okay. So in January, with a number of other people, I led what was called the Thermodynamic Computing Workshop, in which we were trying to brainstorm sort of the future of these ideas. And there will be a report coming out in a few months. So if you're interested in these things, a lot of the ideas are captured in it, as well as the research challenges and the scientific directions and so forth that we imagine might be happening. So it was an interesting meeting because I had collections of people there who were basically theoretical physicists and chemists, electron device people, mostly novel electron device people, neural network people, computer architects, a whole slew of people who, had different perspectives on what might be done. And we were trying to come up with a concept. And there will be a session at the American Association of Advancement Science meeting this, November on thermodynamic computing. So here's what I see as a vision for how this could actually be done. And then in the next section, I'm going to talk about a neural network where I try to do all of these things, not all of these things, but capture many of the ideas that I just said. So we need to develop some model thermodynamic systems. This thermodynamic neural network is one example of that. We could do further thermodynamic optimization of classical computing. The state transitions that we choose to make today are not thermodynamically constrained or optimized. We could augment classical computing systems with thermodynamic elements. And essentially, the way I look at the neuromorphic computing today, that's pretty much what's going on. Okay, we're taking a classical computing system and we're trying to augment it with components. You might think of them as neurons or synapses that have some relationship to the thermodynamics that I'm talking about, although maybe we don't explicitly recognize it as such yet. It becomes more apparent when you look at things like memristors, where clearly there's thermodynamics that are driving state changes in the devices. But thermodynamics drives the state changes of all the devices. All the CMOS devices, it's all about thermodynamics. It's just that in today's computing systems, we completely constrain the sequence of thermodynamic state transitions so that they appear to be a machine. Then we could do what I call complex thermodynamic networks. This would be where we relax sort of the architectural constraints that we've placed into the system in sort of this previous generation. And then lastly, if we want to incorporate quantum effects, which are actually unavoidable at the scales that we're talking about, but if we want to incorporate coherence effects, then we just start making them cold. Right. So thermodynamic neural network. If it turns out you're interested in this, there's a manuscript on archive. Just search thermodynamic neural network, you'll find it. Okay, so what motivated me to do this was while I was at DARPA and I funded the physical intelligence program, I saw this really simple demonstration of beads assembling in oil. Okay, and it was done by Alfred Hubler, who recently died. He was at Illinois. And so I'm going to show you, this is actually an example from a group at Stanford, and they have a nice video, which is why I'm borrowing it here. But what's going on here is, so there's this petri dish, there's oil, a layer of oil, bottom of the dish, and then there are these metallic beads sort of stuck in the dish. There's a high voltage electrode sort of hung over the center of it, and then there's a grounded electrode all the way around the outside of the dish. And this is what happens when you turn on the potential. Let's go back to the beginning. Okay. So when I looked at this, I said, wow, look at that. Applied this potential, this thing is organizing itself. I can see the fluctuations in it. As it gets really good at conducting the electricity and basically joining the complementary potentials, it stabilizes. Actually, it doesn't go far enough in the video to show that, but that's what happens. Okay? So that was sort of the basic idea. I was saying, so why can't I build a neural network that does a similar sort of thing? And so I came up with this thermodynamic neural network model. And, I was initially inspired by Ising models, things like, from which the Hopfield nets and the Boltzmann machines came from. However, none of those would work. None of those would do these fluctuation, dissipation, stabilization ideas. At least I couldn't get them to work. And so, however, they're the things that inspired me, so they're the things that are maybe closest to the thermodynamic neural network idea that I have. So in an Ising model, you've got essentially bidirectional symmetric weights, so every node is talking to all the nodes that it's connected to both ways. And you're trying to find a joint selection of node states that minimize the energy. And sometimes you can do some weight updating if you really work hard at some of the ideas, which I didn't like very much. Also, the Ising model is kind of a single compartment model, so all of the inputs feed into a single summation, and then that's what the Ising model does. So in this thermodynamic neural network, and it has sort of a magnetic inspiration, right? So you have magnets, and they're orienting ferromagnetically or antiferromagnetically, depending on the sign of the weight. But what I was trying to do was I wanted to come up with a model that conducted charge. And the idea was the node was going to choose a state that would efficiently move charge through it, and that if it collected a bunch of charge on itself, then its energy was high. Okay? So what it needs to do, it needs to connect different sources of charge. And the way I decided to do it was, well, if there's positive charge and negative charge, I don't want them to come in and annihilate each other, as would happen in an Ising model or a single compartment model like a perceptron. I wanted them to sort of motivate the state by making the charge sort of flow past each other, okay, without annihilating each other, which is actually unphysical. There's no reason charges should annihilate each other, but we do it all the time in neural networks. So the key concept here that was incorporated that I hadn't seen in other neural network models was conservation laws, okay? Constantly trying to respect charge conservation laws in this model. So it turns out that when I did this and I applied the other constraints, which I'll describe in a moment, that the inputs that I came into a node actually naturally divided up into four different compartments. And that those four different compartments had to do with both the sign of the charge and the sign of the potential or the sign of the weight associated with that charge. And that the node was forced, I constrained the node has to make a choice to either connect two of the compartments and have charge flow through two of them, or to connect the other two and have charge flow through the other two. Okay? And so that's the essential idea. It took me a very long time to sort of figure it out and get it to work, and I'm not going to try to explain all the math to you here, but that's the intuition. Okay? Now, the other intuition that I had was that, when I make a state decision that I'm going to connect two compartments and make the charge flow between the two, I don't want to wipe out the charge that may be accumulated or the weights that may be in the other compartments, because they have information that may be valuable to me in a later time step. Okay? So what I do is I choose two compartments. The node chooses two compartments. It updates its state, and then it updates the weights and the charges associated with those compartments, but it leaves the other compartments alone. So qualitatively, this is like having a task list in which I've got a bunch of things on my task list, all right? And what I would like to do is I would like to do the easy, big things first, right? Choose my state that way. But when I do that, I don't want to wipe out all of the other things on my task list that are still there. I mean, I'd like to, but I probably can't. But in our current neural network models, what we do, I think, in the updates, because we're so focused on these single compartment models, is that we're wiping out all this other information in the process of making an update for a particular choice. That's not what we want to do. So, if you looked at the energy of the node, this is the node energy at the bottom for the Ising model versus the thermodynamic network. This is a single compartment idea. There are four different compartments associated with the different sign of the input potentials and the weights coming into the node. You can think of these as filters. I call them kinetic factors, but these are the things that prevent us from wiping out compartments with information that we choose not to act on at this particular moment. And I think this could be extended to include many more compartments. This is not about charge, actually. It's about connecting complementary potentials. We could have dozens of different kinds of potentials coming into a node, compartmentalized in different ways, making choices to do one thing now and other things later, and preserving all the information related to the later states. So then what happens in this neural network model, as you would expect, is I connect them all together. And in the examples that I'm going to show you in a few minutes, they're all connected. Almost all of them are connected as a nearest neighbor grid model in a torus with boundary conditions. So there would be a node at every one of these intersections. And then also, in some of them I'll show you, there are external nodes that bias the networks. They basically drive charge of different positive and negative into the network that sort of force it to organize in some way or another. Now, in general, the networks can have any configuration you want. They don't have to be nearest neighbors. It's just that the nearest neighbors networks are easy to visualize, and it was the only thing I could debug when I was doing it. But you can connect them randomly. They all work. Okay, so here are the conceptual highlights of the model. And I'm going to do this instead of taking you through a bunch of equations because I think that would just lose you, take you through all the math. So as I said before, the node inputs are separated into 4 compartments by the signs of the input potential and the weight, and they're grouped into 2 pairs of complementary inputs. And the node is forced to make a choice about which compartments it's going to use. And so, and the physical idea behind this is that there were positive and negative charges that interact, but they don't cancel because they're conserved. And let me come back to that point for just a second. So potentials are associated with imbalances in conserved quantities. When you get a potential difference, it's because you've got too much positive charge in one place relative to negative charge in another place. And the process of equilibration is the idea of basically curing these imbalances. That's what equilibration is about. But if you're going to talk about potentials, you have to talk about conservation and the thing that caused the potential. So this network evolves spontaneously to connect complementary potentials. They can be internal potentials that are locally formed, or they can be external potentials. The edge states adapt in selected compartments without destroying edge states in other compartments. That's the idea that I just mentioned. Long-term memory is stored in edge weights, and short-term memory is stored in residual charge, also on the edges. All the adaptation is by relaxation to Boltzmann statistics. That's it, period. Adaptation is coupled to charge dissipation, which is coupled to fluctuations in the network. It does rapid, global, reversible relaxation of the node states, followed by a slower, local, irreversible adaptation of the edge states. And this is the way it learns, and this is the way it creates a complex multi-scale system. You can connect these nodes in any way you like. They're always stable. The node and edge updates are continuous and online. There are no learning rates, and there's no backpropagation. Everything's local. And finally, the thermodynamic neural network unifies some of these ideas that I was talking about earlier, having to do with fluctuation, dissipation, adaptation, equilibration, and conservation in a common physical model. And in so doing, it illustrates a complex, multi-scale, self-organizing system. So, I'm going to sort of take you through, quickly as I can, what it does. All right? So this is a nearest neighbor network. It's just 400 nodes. And each of these squares is a node, and the color represents the state of the node. If the node is white, it's a 1. If the node is black, it's a -1. And if it's gray, it's somewhere in between. Okay? This particular network is completely isolated. There's no external biasing. And in this case, they're only connected to their 4 nearest neighbors. Now what you see is, and I'll show you some videos of this in a second, these are snapshots from the video of an evolution. What you see is these local domains of antiferromagnetic order. I call it antiferromagnetic order. But what it means is that adjacent nodes tend to want to order. So if this one's positive, the adjacent one is negative. And the reason that happens is, remember, I'm trying to make positive and negative charge flow in opposite directions. So if I have a weight and I want positive and negative charge flowing in opposite directions, I get this plus-minus configuration. Now, it's not perfectly ordered because there are thermal fluctuations, and you'll see those in the videos. So you get domain walls, okay? So you see local areas of antiferromagnetic order. Let's see. So the other thing about, the other special thing about these neighbor networks is that they're naturally bipartitioned. And bipartitioning means that then there's basically two groups of nodes. And if you're in one group, you can connect only to nodes in the other group, but not to nodes in your own group. And what that does, the bipartition networks have no what I call geometric frustration in this, at least in theory, they have no geometric frustration in this ordering problem. They could, in principle, order entirely uniformly and antiferromagnetically. Networks that are not naturally bipartitioned cannot do that. They are inherently geometrically frustrated. And I'm not going to show you any of those, actually, but they all work. Okay? You just get these frustrations, and you get domain walls and so forth. Now, I don't like looking at antiferromagnetic order in these plots, so what I do is I simply make it look ferromagnetic by changing the polarity of the display in every alternate node on the board, okay? So now you can see domains that look primarily white, primarily black, and you can see like mixtures of black and white domains. Just easier to look at. It's the same exact physics, nothing's changed, only the display has changed. Now this is what happens, if I add, these green nodes are biased nodes, and so they're fixed state nodes, or they may be nodes that change periodically. Then they have large weights that connect them to the network. And so what happens if you just put a single node into the network is that it polarizes the nodes around it, okay? As you would likely expect in a physical system. And if you make the bias strong or weak, it polarizes a larger or smaller region around the node. And remember, there's thermal fluctuations that are trying to disrupt the ordering, and that's what limits the size of the potential diffusion. The other thing I'll point out here is that in these bipartition networks, depending on which partition you put the node in, the same positive bias can appear as a black node or a white node, okay? The black domain or a white domain, I should say. So what happens when you put complementary potentials in? Positive and negative potentials in this case. So here, in all of these cases, there's one positive node and one negative node. What happens is they first polarize the regions around them, and then when those regions connect, they create strong connections between the two of them, because they're trying to transport charge between the two. And so if you put these nodes in opposite partitions, like I've done here and here, they make a nice bridge and they can connect. If you put them in the same partition, they're geometrically frustrated, and they can't connect. They can't sustain this underlying antiferromagnetic order. It's out of phase. And so what they do is they build a domain wall. Okay? So here's a domain wall. Now, if I put in two external nodes of the same potential, what happens is, if they're in the same partition, they can jointly polarize a region, as is done here, but they don't build strong connections between them because they can't transport any charge between them. If I put them in opposite partitions, however, they polarize differently. Well, one will polarize white, one will polarize black, so you'll get a domain wall because of this geometric frustration effect. Okay. So in this case, this is a network simulation. This is going to be a video. And this is 40,000 nodes, so every little dot on here is a node. This is an isolated network. There's no external bias. And every node is connected to its four nearest neighbors. So this is what happens when you turn it on, so to speak, right? I just started off I just randomly initialize it and let it evolve. And so this is what thermal fluctuations do to a system like this. Okay? So you get this interesting, complex, multi-scale stuff going on, which I contend is probably what you want as a kind of substrate for learning if you're going to do if you're going to learn any sort of generic thing, or if you want to search a complex space. You need a complex set of fluctuations in order to search it. Now, there are parameters in the model associated with temperature and so forth that I can use to sort of select how much fluctuations I get, and so what the fluctuations look like and so forth. Anyway, this was one of the first results I got that I said, okay, I think I'm on the right track. Now, here's a different network, different in two ways. So the networks that I've shown you so far had like 101 node states between -1 and 1 that the node could select. In this case, I've just made the nodes binary. They can be plus or minus 1. And in this case, they're connected to, there's 16 nearest neighbors that are in the opposite partition that they are in. So the network is still bipartite. And I've selected the temperatures to create a somewhat fluid state, but also one that allows some ordering. And so when you turn it on, this is what happens. Again, there's no external bias in this node, in this network. And so it interestingly forms these nice ribbon domains. And it's what I find particularly interesting are sort of the fluctuations along the boundaries of the domains. These domain walls, by the way, are the places where charge tends to be stored because the node is having to make a choice between being either white or black. So it stores charge, and that creates fluctuations that happen in later time. Okay, so now in this particular case, this is a 16 nearest neighbor bipartite graph, 40,000 nodes, no external bias, and I've selected the relative node and weight temperatures to be such that it undergoes what looks like a first order phase transition. Okay, and it takes a while because I can make it order almost in a split second, but it's not very interesting. It's really interesting to watch it order. So what you'll notice are domains of white and black start forming in various regions, and they start to stabilize. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit. It's fascinating to watch, actually, to watch this thing order itself. It's eventually going to become all one domain with lots of complex local thermal excitations on top of that domain. And the white domain is going to win, okay? And it's really cool at the end watching the black domain die. That's what I'm going to try to show you here. Okay, so here's the black domain in the throes of its extinction, where it's working really hard, it looks like to me, to try to survive. But it just can't, right? So it's just getting peeled apart at the edges. And I know I'm anthropomorphizing this a little bit, but to me it sort of connoted, sort of the struggle for existence in some way, right? Now, here what's interesting is you can see complex sort of thermal excitations on top of an otherwise uniform background, okay? And I think those complex excitations are probably what we're looking at in brains and so forth a lot of the time, like when we're looking at them in the resting state. Now, if you look at sort of entropy and energy versus time in these sorts of networks, you can see phase transitions. So these are averages over all the nodes, sort of the node energy and the node entropy. And you can see, that the entropy is reducing down to time. This is the death throw at the right at the end of the black domain. And you can see that both the energy and the entropy are decreasing. And it looks like a first order phase transition. And this is something I think would be really cool to do. If we could put this model on a substrate like Loihi, and we programmed it correctly, we could see on a computing substrate a first order phase transition, which I don't think has ever been done. Okay? We could literally measure the amount of energy that the chip is consuming and watch it go down as the thing orders. Okay? I think that would be a stunning statement of what things might be like in the future if we did that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what happens when I add external biases, external potentials that force the network to organize. And in this case, there are 16 pairs. They are little green dots that you can barely see here all over the place. And they're organized into pairs, and each pair is sort of flipping its state periodically at different periods, okay? And what happens, this is what happens as the network evolves. You'll see the potentials propagating through the network as they change, and you'll see the connections become stronger between the various nodes as the network learns. This is otherwise the identical network to the network I showed you a moment ago where it did that phase transition. Just has these external potentials. So you can see it's getting better and better at sort of dividing up its state space into more and more coherent configurations. And what it's doing is just basically becoming more and more efficient at transporting charge. So what it does is it just carves out boundaries, right? And it's sending charge in one direction in one domain and charge in another direction in another domain, and it builds a domain wall perfectly where it needs to build it so that it does this optimally, which I think is what needs to happen. Now you might say, what in the heck does this mean, Todd? You know, what are these things actually doing? Well, the way I view it is if I looked at the structure of this network, you can see it has this complex structure. Oh, and by the way, it generalizes really well because most of the situations it's seeing, it hasn't seen before. It just knows that charge conducts this way and this way frequently, and so it generalizes pretty well. But what it does when I look at it is I said, oh, it's built a representation of the external potentials internally. A relatively simple one. So that probably if I put a classifier on top of this and looked at some of the nodes, this could be a reservoir of sorts, right? And then I could be able to extract what's going on in the external world from this sort of simple representation of it that this model has built. So just as a last example, this is just the case of a randomly connected network. And this is what happens when you get a randomly connected network. You get lots of frustration built in. The domains spontaneously form, just as I said before, but it's hard to look at. Okay, the only point I want to make here is that it's exactly the same as those bipartite nearest neighbor networks. It's just they're hard to look at. Okay, I'm going to skip this one, but I do want to say this, and I know I'm running out of time. So this is what I think is going on, how multi-scale complex systems evolve thermodynamically. Okay, and I'm going to talk about evolution at different temporal and spatial scales, okay? So I've got large spatial scale here, small spatial scale here, slow time here, large, faster times here, okay? And so what I did in this network, which I didn't actually describe, but is described in the paper, is I did two things. I did large-scale rapid adaptation, and then I followed it with, which you can think of as the equilibration of the network or the selection of the node states or the inference step or whatever the hell it is you want to call it, okay? You do rapid, large-scale adaptation, and then you follow that by a slow, smaller-scale adaptation, which is the update of the edge states or the weights, okay? Now, the point is here that, if you're going to be a successful organism, you have to be able to do this, right? You have to be able to adapt rapidly to the changes in your environment. Otherwise, you're dead, okay? The other thing you have to be able to do is because your environment is stable is you have to learn it so that you're good at doing this later. So, this step I call fluctuation and equilibration. It's brain activity in biological neural networks. It's forward path in the artificial neural network. And it's a Markov chain Monte Carlo technique that I use in the thermodynamic neural network. Here, it's synaptic plasticity in biological neural networks. It's a way to update in artificial neural networks or a way to update in thermodynamic neural network. And this is the dissipation adaptation stage. And there's a thing that integrates them, which is, for example, spike timing dependent plasticity, backpropagation, or charge correction in the model that I use, okay? This is the thing that joins this and makes this a complex multi-scale system. And it's also true, though, in other non-sort of neural systems. So here's an example of a biological genetic system. The fluctuation equilibration step is natural selection. You're either killed by the environment or you survive. The adaptation step is genetic adaptation. And the thing that connects the two is reproduction, okay? And then you get complex multi-scale systems. More generally, it looks like this. I've got an environmental potential that's large scale and changing slowly, right? I need to be able to adapt to it rapidly at large scale. I need to make adaptations at a smaller scale that can reflect how this is changing. And then at this, down here at the small scale, fast scale, I've got a heat bath where I'm just dumping all the stuff that I can't use. Okay? That's the more generic idea. All right, conclusions. So I think that the current computing paradigm and technology are mature, but performance is still far from fundamental limits. The challenges to the current paradigm are all thermodynamic. They're power consumption, fluctuations, and self-organization. The long and interdependent histories of thermodynamics and computing are not over. We are poised, I think, for an enormous conceptual and technological breakthrough again. Modern electronics are well suited to the development of a new class of computing systems, thermodynamic computers. And lastly, this thermodynamic neural network is a model system that unifies concepts of fluctuation, dissipation, adaptation, equilibration, and conservation under a model that illustrate a self-organizing, complex, adaptive system. So I'm interested in working with you on the following. I've done all this by myself, by the way, over the last roughly 12 years. I'm tired of doing this by myself. I would like to create the theory that incorporates adaptation and conservation into the next generation of fluctuation and dissipation theorems. I would like to illustrate thermodynamic phase transitions in neuromorphic. I would like to illustrate thermodynamic evolution in hardware that's not all software. I would like to find application ideas for the thermodynamic neural network. I would like to change the way we think about things, and I'd like to do any good ideas you have that I haven't thought of. So if you're interested in these ideas or working with me on them, I'm happy to engage with you because I cannot do this any longer by myself. So that's it.
Thank you, Todd. Very good. So we've got a few minutes for a couple questions.
Excuse me. Yeah. Right. Yeah, it does. I guess I would make two comments, I think. I guess the first thing I think is that when we lack a conceptual paradigm, we have to start with simpler things rather than more complicated. And when we lack a conceptual paradigm, we hamper ourselves by trying to do applications that we're not ready for. Okay? So I think both in the neuroscience community and in the machine learning community, we are not actually trying to solve the basic problems that challenge us, probably because we can't get anybody to pay us to do them. So my answer is I don't know the answer to your question yet. I do know that I can put all kinds of different nodes into this model that I've already built. I can put Ising nodes in there, and I can put AND nodes and OR nodes and all kinds of junk. It's really simple once you get this off the ground to imagine different kinds of nodes to put in there and to make heterogeneous systems. The great thing about having these bidirectional, symmetrically weighted networks is that they do have a simple energy landscape, and you can use computational techniques to search that landscape and find them. Okay? I contend there, however, that our brains don't have the problem of having to use a computational framework to do what they do. All right? So we are limited by the fact that we have to come up, for example, with an algorithm that searches a space to find a minimum, and we can only do that in very limited cases. I suspect that natural systems can do that much more generically. For example, finding, the expensive part of doing this simulation is the Monte Carlo chain where I'm trying to find the low energy node states. And it's the hardest part. It's the part that screws up all the time. All I'm trying to do is find a low energy state, right? I'm just trying to relax the equilibrium. Well, presumably natural systems do that for free all the time, right? They're not running a Markov Monte Carlo chain to do it. So I guess I'm saying there's a lot of stuff we don't understand. For that reason, I like the simple models. I think we got away from them for a while because we got stuck with them, but I think we can get unstuck.
One more question?
Information entropy and physical entropy for a long time. James tried to resolve that with maximum entropy. Where does that sit?
Okay.
The information entropy, physical entropy within your system?
Yeah, great question. I can't say that I know all of the answers, but I'll say a couple of things about it. Firstly, information entropy, as far as I understand it, doesn't have a concept of conservation of a physical quantity. It also generally doesn't have a natural concept of scale, of how much, which is associated with conservation. So there's a mismatch there between when we think of entropy in a thermodynamic case and entropy in an information domain. The other thing I would say is that in an information domain, the thing that the information is about is not explicit, right? I mean, if I give you a data set, it's just a bunch of bits, unless I tell you what it's about, okay? Also, what that information is for, I mean, it's for something, right? I've collected it for some purpose, is also not explicitly a part of the information set. But if you think of physical quantities that are conserved, that must go places, that run through a physical entity, then a lot of those sorts of questions just naturally disappear. They become part of the system rather than this thing that's external to it, or that requires a human interpretation. I mean, certainly, I love that work. I mean, when I first read it, I said, oh man, finally somebody did equilibrium thermodynamics in a way I can understand. But it doesn't do these other physical things, right? It's still, it's still an information argument.
All right, well, let's thank Todd again.